Hello and welcome to this webinar on the geopolitics of religion and culture in Asia. My name is Judd Birdsall. I serve as a senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, as well as a senior advisor on the religion team at the United States Institute of Peace, USIP. I'm so delighted that the Berkley Center and USIP are co-sponsoring this event today and have been partners since 2022. On this project exploring the geopolitics of religion and how it shapes conflict and peace dynamics in regions and countries all around the world. I want to give the floor to my colleague, Julia Schiwal, who's a program officer at USIP's Religion and Inclusive Societies team. She will introduce our panelists and moderate our discussion today. Again, welcome to all of you. Julia, thank you for your leadership on this project and for facilitating our conversation today.
Of course. Thank you, Judd, and thanks to all of our panelists who have worked with us on this project for joining us today. And thanks as well to everyone tuning into this webinar. We will have Q&A at the end, and we're really looking forward to seeing what questions you may have. Before I go into introducing some of our great panelists today and prompting them with a couple different questions about their work in the project, I'm going to briefly discuss the U.S. Institute of Peace and our interest in this conversation. The U.S. Institute of Peace was established by an act of U.S. Congress in 1984 under President Ronald Reagan, and our mission is to mitigate, prevent, and resolve deadly conflict all around the world. One of our teams, the oldest thematic program at the Institute, is the religion program, which is the team that I'm on. And we interpret our responsibility widely to develop religious literacy, which is better understanding of religion in the world that we can provide to policymakers to help them look out there and see how religion, peace, and conflict all fit together. And we also understand our work as being the global hub of premier expertise on strategic religious engagement. And through these two big pillars, we work with government partners, local peace builders, and religious actors all around the world to contribute to a less violent and more peaceful global society. This specific project has come out of a very important effort of the Institute and the Berkley Center to understand the way that religion matters now in the world today differently than religion mattered 40 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago. I was trained as a historian, and taking a step back, we can talk about a couple big periods for religion in modern global political history. One of those big periods was religion in the Cold War as a moral battleground between colonialism and colonial nations, and decolonization, and between capitalism and communism. Following the end of the Cold War, religion began to matter as part of a human rights discourse, and that's what gave us much of the religious freedom, legal infrastructure, and international infrastructure that we have today. And then after 9/11 in 2001, religion became one of two things. First off, it began to matter to states a lot more than it previously had mattered, as nations began to ask how they can properly do counterterrorism. But in response to some of the negative early engagements with religion in 2001, 2002, and 2003, it spawned a positive way to engage with religion through what we call strategic religious engagement and religious peace building, where governments began to understand many of the security issues facing us in the world are not because of religion, but because of other factors or armed groups or insurgencies with pre-existing priorities that used religion as a tool. And we understood at the Institute that engaging with religious communities was a way to combat a lot of those violent actors. In August of 2021, with the US evacuation from Afghanistan, the global war on terror ended. And we've entered a new political moment, a moment which we're still trying to understand and define. Some call it an era of great powers, some call it strategic rivalry. But in this era, states and nations all around the world, especially in Asia, which is the focus of today's conversation, because they became acquainted and more closely intertwined with religious and cultural engagement in the global war on terror, didn't simply give up all of these religion and cultural engagement tools once that war ended. Rather, they found them a new purpose in an era of geopolitical competition, where religion, morality, and culture mattered a lot more and were a lot more powerful. That's a new dimension to international geopolitical competition that we haven't seen for a very long time. And it's a very new area of competition for many working in international affairs and foreign policy. Under our institute's efforts to understand religion and world affairs, we entered this project to understand what it means to have religion become a part of geopolitical culture in a powerful new way. The experts on our panel today all look at different elements of ways that religion matters in global politics. And I'm so glad to welcome them to join us today. I'll start off with Mohammed Sinan Sayak, who wrote an excellent article about the impact of Hidatva in Nepal, working with us. Mohammed Sinan Sayak is a doctoral candidate in Islamic and Middle East Studies at the University of Edinburgh and a lecturer in politics at King's College London and the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. His work focuses on security, foreign policy, and religion in South Asia and the Middle East. And I'll turn to him first for a question about some of the dynamics we're seeing. Sinan, you've described the relationship between India and Nepal as a love-hate relationship. Why would you characterize the relationship that way, and what relevance does it have to the global politics of religion?
Sure. Thanks, Julia. First of all, thank you for having me on over here. This question was an interesting one, even when I initially started studying the relationship of India and Nepal. So Nepal in general, because it's a landlocked country and it's India's neighbor, there is a lot of freedom of movement between India and Nepal, where Indians can go and live and work in Nepal and vice versa. You also have, for example, and these are the love parts of it, right? So you have the fact that Gurkhas, who come from Nepal, serve as elite units within the Indian army as well. And there's a lot of shared culture, shared language, scripts, even songs for that matter, because they're all along the borders. But that said, despite the fact that there seems to be such close relations, there have also been a lot of conflicts, so to say, in a way, or like tensions, more than conflicts, where, for example, in 2015, India once blockaded Nepal for about 6 months because it had concerns with some of Nepal's internal issues. And a lot of Nepali politicians feel that sometimes India is this big brother figure that is, infringing on its sovereignty. A lot of treaties that are there between the two of them have also been considered as unequal by a lot of Nepali politicians. And then there have been issues with maps. For example, there have been disputes with the drawing of maps. Both of them also claim to have the birthplace of Buddha, who is essentially a very important figure, a religious figure as well. And what's interesting is, and it'll lead into the next answer, which I'll get to in a while. But essentially, the fact is that some of the religious dynamics, because there are a lot of temples, there are a lot of religious schools, these also start playing roles later on within the foreign policy, equations between the two nations as well. So this is how the love-hate relationship is, and the fact that there are shared cultures and shared values, religious values as well, lead to some level of discussion, which we later have about, the foreign policy impact.
Thank you. I'll turn to Rohit Chopra next, who worked with us to understand Hinduism more broadly and its impact on soft power, and in particular, the remaking of Indian public culture, which is obviously deeply linked to a lot of the stuff that Sinan is looking at in Nepal. Rohit Chopra is a professor of communication at Santa Clara University who specializes in global online communities and the interplay of media, culture, and political memory. His work examines the dynamics of Hindu nationalism and right-wing movements in digital spaces. Rohit, there's a lot of talk about Hindu nationalism, but I often find there is little discussion of why this nationalism is so appealing to so many people. In your own words, how would you explain Hindutva's appeal to someone like a factory worker in Calcutta?
First of all, delighted to be here. Thanks very much, Julia, and thanks for the kind invitation to everyone at the center and USIP. It's a fantastic question, and actually, it reminds me of something a professor of mine said when I was starting my dissertation, when she handed me a copy of Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities about the reflections on the origin and spread of nationalism, and she said, well, this book answers the question: why do people go to fight? Why are they willing to fight and die for this abstract thing called the nation, but not for something like refrigerators, right? And it sounded facetious, but it was only partly facetious. So I think the question there, it's the same sort of question in a sense that you're asking, like, why is the factory worker in Kolkata going to, feel motivated to sort of riot or vote for the BJP or take a particular stance? And I think that has to do really with the cultural legitimacy of Hindu nationalism. And to understand the cultural legitimacy of Hindu nationalism, that's something that goes directly to really the topic of this webinar that we're having. We need to understand this sort of Hindu right and the project of Hindu nationalism in India as one that seeks to transform Indian public culture in terms of three overlapping trajectories. On the one hand, it's a 100-year-long project, right? The RSS was founded in 1925, which is the kind of mothership Hindu right organization. Next year is going to be the 100th anniversary, and it's not going to be a fun time to visit India. It was marginalized in the decades after independence because the person who assassinated Mahatma Gandhi was associated with the Hindu right. It's a 40-year project, which sort of took root in the 1980s when very sort of consciously they started cultivating the Hindu diaspora overseas, and they started sort of focusing on some particular emotive issues. But I think to the question of what motivates the factory worker, it's also seen best as a sort of, I'd say, a 10-year project, which is Hindu nationalism in the post-Modi era. And there it's been extremely, extremely successful in, I think, managing to secure a widespread sort of cultural legitimacy. In the run-up to the 2014 general election in India, you had the Congress party still making references to nationalism, right? Secularism or secular nationalism, right? Nehruvian secularism, which was sort of in some ways the ideology of the Congress, the professed ideology of the Indian nation state. It still had some purchase. That has completely disappeared. And the way the BJP has been able to do it and the Hindu right has been able to do it has been through a range of things, taking over the media, soft power initiatives, think tanks, Bollywood. So it's been a comprehensive totalizing project in a sense, and it's been very successful. And I think I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Eric Schlussel, who wrote about the myth of foreign forces in Xinjiang. Eric Schlussel is a longtime friend of mine and an associate professor of history and international affairs and the director of the Sigger Center for Asian Studies at George Washington University. His research focuses on the history and contemporary issues of Xinjiang, and he's supported by fellowships from prestigious organizations like the Social Science Research Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Tying to what Rohit discussed, which is the cultural relevancy of Hindu nationalism for regular people, there's another very culturally relevant issue in the United States now and over the past few years that you have done an enormous amount of work on, and that's the issues of Uyghurs in Xinjiang and their treatment by the Chinese government. Despite the fact that enormous attention has been paid to the issues that Uyghurs have faced over the past 8 years, which is a major religious and human rights issue, little progress has been made. Eric, from your perspective, what makes advancing rights and security for Uyghurs so difficult?
It's a complex question. Thank you, Julia. It's good to see you, and thank you to USIP and Georgetown for having me in to the Berkley Center. I'll give you 2 external factors and 2 internal factors just to keep things simple. But the basic problem I see is that, at least among powerful countries and powerful organizations that could influence the situation, the majority are simply anti-China. They're not sufficiently pro-Uyghur or pro-Uyghur in their stance. That is, most of the attention given to the Uyghur issue in the US, especially into Europe, is frequently, when there's an organization behind it with power or money, it's really about scoring points and showing that they're anti-China or tough on China. And they know that they can basically make statements in support of Uyghurs without really having to do very much concretely to actually help them. As for states that are more proximal to China, the calculus is extremely clear, and it's been explained to me by military analysts from certain countries like Pakistan or Turkey, that the geopolitical calculus does not make it worthwhile to stand up to China on Uyghur issues or Uyghur rights. Turkey had done it before, and they've since abandoned that stance. Indeed, Turkey, which used to be a haven for Uyghurs abroad, is no longer considered safe to be Uyghur in. People who've even gotten Turkish citizenship are leaving Turkey or Turkey because they no longer feel that they're safe or stable there. The same is true in somewhere like Pakistan. We can see this example in a place like Thailand, right, which is so closely tied to China. And as you recently saw, I believe, in the New York Times with Nairullah Elima's piece, there are people who have been stuck there as refugees for over a decade now. The international community could easily help these people if there were the will there, but there's simply not the will to stand up to China on the behalf of what's essentially a cross-border population that many countries see as alien or destabilizing. Kazakhstan's a paradigmatic example of that. Now, internally, I think, and this is partly why I was writing about what I was writing about, there's a misdiagnosis of problems on the ground in Xinjiang. There has been, arguably for 2.5 centuries, but especially since the 1950s, a persistent misanalysis of the causes of discontent and violence at the grassroots level. And I can go into that in detail on a later question, but this myth of foreign forces has been used to wallpaper over a lot of local problems that could have been investigated, but instead, thanks to the echo chambers created by originally the Maoist party state and then later the Reform era, and especially the Xi state, those sorts of critiques and that real data from the ground has never really gotten to the top, especially where it comes to religion and the Chinese party state's fundamental misunderstanding of how it works in Uyghur society. Now, if the party state were willing to listen, that might be different. But over the past 10 years, especially since the imprisonment of Ilham Tohti and later of some of my friends and colleagues, there's a persistent refusal to look for alternative perspectives that might nuance the understanding of the situation on the ground in Xinjiang. As one member of the Chinese government recently said to me, why would a state make policies that upset their own citizens and that harm their own citizens? They really think they're doing the right thing. And even if they agree about what some of the causes of the problems are, they still fundamentally only have a statist toolkit to deal with these problems. And so the issues persist. Though that's the short answer.
And I'm sure we could spend a lot longer talking about all of the different dimensions of this. Thank you, Eric. I'm going to turn now to Bianca Truffaut. Bianca is a PhD candidate at the George Washington University who studies North Korean and Cold War history with a focus on modern Chinese history. Her work explores social history, national identity, and the role of childhood in shaping North Korean society during the Cold War. What I find so interesting and compelling about some of the work that Bianca did with us about Christianity on the Korean Peninsula is that it explores something about which has a lot of secular narratives, but very few religious narratives or stories that engage with the religious dimensions of the conflict. Bianca wrote an excellent piece for us about Christianity on the peninsula, which brought light to a lot of things which aren't covered well. Bianca, I would like to ask you, while it's well known that South Korea has many religious communities, there's almost no understanding of the nature of religion in North Korea. What should people know about religion in North Korea, and what do people often get wrong about religion in North Korea?
Thank you to the Berkley Center, and especially thanks, Julia, for this opportunity. So I think there's a misconception that the political ideology of North Korea called Juche, right, which we hear about all the time and is talked about a lot. There's this misconception that it's like a totalizing ideology that essentially functions as a religion in North Korea, in which North Koreans worship the Kim family, like Kim Jong-un and his family. And I think while there certainly are some religious aspects like to the cult of personality of the Kim family, I think scholars and popular sources alike tend to overstate the power and the reach of this ideology in North Korea, because Pyongyang was a religious center before the Cold War division of the peninsula, and the state has always had an ambivalent relationship with religion, as for the state, it prioritizes the stability of the state, and it's suspicious of foreign influence, understandably. So as far as the North Korean state was concerned, as long as Protestants' worship did not get in the way of the state's goals and of the construction of socialism, the state has generally sanctioned religiosity. So Protestantism in particular has existed in both authorized and unauthorized forms since the founding of North Korea in 1948. And now there are estimated to be around 400,000 Protestants in North Korea, but actually the number is probably higher. And there are also populations of Catholics, and there's adherence to the indigenous religion of Chondoism. And Chondoism in particular has always been kind of not only authorized by the state, but kind of celebrated by the state because it's an indigenous Korean religion. So it's like an expression of, quote unquote Koreanness. And the Chondoist Cheonggu Party, the political party, even has seats in the Supreme People's Assembly in North Korea, and it's consistently had seats since 1948. So generally, the North Korean state expresses more openness toward religion, I would say, like as an overture to international cooperation. And that's certainly how Protestantism became more authorized and increased its official presence in North Korea since especially the 90s. So like international Protestant groups, especially South Korean Protestant groups, have been involved in North Korea since the late 1970s. And even Reverend Billy Graham visited North Korea in 1992. He gave a sermon at the Protestant church in Pyongyang, and he even gifted Kim Il sung a Bible. So that was like an unprecedented moment of religious cooperation. And since then, the government has talked pretty positively about Protestantism and about religion in general, and relations between North Korean Protestantism and like international Protestantism have been quite good. So North Korean Protestantism has like increasingly become more involved and more integrated into international Protestantism. And that's why I believe that religion and Protestantism in particular can be a tool for cooperation and for dialogue between North Korea and other countries and other like non-state actors and religious groups.
Thank you, Bianca. And that tracks to a lot of trends that we're seeing across the geopolitics of religion and culture in Asia, which is that religion is not becoming less important in the world. It is becoming more important in new and interesting ways. At the Institute, one of the reasons we talk about this, or the reasons why we theorize why this might be happening, is because in a moment of great power rivalry, there's a lot of uncertainty about global politics. And politics is, at the end of the day, only who gets what. Making those decisions of distribution and allocation of power are moral questions and questions about what a good society and good international order looks like. For so many people in the world, the ideas that inform their perception of good order are religious and moral ideas. And I think across these different parts of research, we can see a lot of common trends. I would go back to Sinan, and I would ask you, how have you seen the relationship between Nepal and India change over time with the growing importance of religion and culture in geopolitics? Specifically, what trends would you identify as important for the policymaker audience to recognize?
Thanks for that, Julia. So a couple of quick thoughts over here, even on the broad idea of religion and foreign policy, right? So the idea is that secularization, as the world becomes industrialized, then there will be a larger level of secularization where people will become more secular, less religious. This was theories propounded in the 17th, 18th century, people like Max Weber, for example. And you had scholars like Peter Berger, for example, who came on much later on in the 1990s, and they spoke about the desecularization of the world, where they said that, oh, you know what, actually, it's not really the case that religion has gone away from the public space. In fact, we are getting to see a rise of religion in public and political space one more time, right? And this has always been the case. It's just that the way discourses have evolved over time have led to this. And I think Asia is a good example of that. I think India and Nepal is a very good example of that, because when we think about something like, a country like Nepal, which had a king, which had a monarchy, right in the 18th century, in the 19th century, they even discussed the idea of their kings being a sort of like an avatar of, one of their gods, essentially, right? And they said that they deified the monarchy, basically. It's to say that, okay, we are having, religious, divine rights and divine sovereignty and so on and so forth. And so there has always been a thread of religion coming in politics, and that was used to mobilize people. It was even during the colonial era as well. What happened throughout, and what's been happening in the last, let's say, 20 to 30 years, is that you have, for example, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, basically, in India, which is, as we all know, it's the sort of like the organization that, the grassroots organization that gives support to the BJP, the current ruling party in India, right? So this organization, which was formed in the 1920s, as Rohit Chopra pointed out, has been instrumental in, or has been quite, observant of Nepali politics and of ensuring especially that the monarchy is in place. So, for example, when there was an abolition of the monarchy in the late 1990s, the 2000s, they were quite worried about it, or they looked at it with a little bit of like, consternation that, okay, why is this happening? This shouldn't be. It essentially is good for us if the monarchy is in place. And so there have been, I think, even the U.S. State Department released reports recently, well, maybe a year or so back, saying that the RSS and the BJP have been involved in funding a lot of groups that are pro-monarchy in Nepal, right? And which, of course, was denied. These charges or these claims were denied by a lot of the groups in Nepal. But you have two major groups, which is the RPP, the Rashtriya Prajatantra Party, and then you have the Nepal Janata Party, right, which is almost like the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is essentially both of these groups have been influenced to some extent. One was in the 1990s, and the other one came as a new group. But the RPP, which was in the 1990s, has now become more influential over time. And many reasons exist for this. So there's an institutional level of support that is provided, between policymakers in India and let's say Nepal, or at least propounded, encouraged, and so on. And then there is, for example, a grassroots level discussion that takes place as well, right? So, for example, this discussion of like some BJP ministers or some BJP politicians engaged in funding, some of the pro-monarchy parties. And then the other is also that there are a lot of schools along the border of Nepal and India which have been set up by groups that are affiliated with the RSS. And finally, you have, for example, the NJP, which has openly said that we are inspired by the BJP in its approach. So what are the changes that you see because of that is previously where it was used more as a mobilizing tool along ethnic lines. Now you have religious lines also that are taken into consideration. What that means is that, for example, there is a lesser toleration of people eating beef, for example. There are cases of, Christians getting targeted as well as Muslims as well. And a few of this does come in from the playbook from India as well, right? So these are some of those trends that we see. But I guess if I were to make a concluding line about the role of Hindutva or Hindu nationalism within foreign policy, I'd say that it is both an end and a means, in that it's not just something where it's ideologically pushed forward. At the end of the day, it's all about, is this a good tool to ensure we have the maximum benefit? And that's not an ideological benefit, but more like a material benefit, which is why, for example, there's always a counterbalance with China, because very recently, or even over the last few weeks, Nepal and China have signed a lot of agreements, and that has alarmed a lot of policymakers in India. So while some policymakers, or while some scholars may say that India is deploying a lot of Hindutva within its foreign policy, a lot of its underlying principles of foreign policy still remain the same from the Nehru era to the current era, and Hindutva just becomes one additional tool which may or may not be deployed depending on the situation that is there.
Thank you so much. Building off of that, I would like to go to Rohit now to talk a little bit more about what are some of the most effective soft power methods that have been used by India to advance geopolitical interests, with a particular focus on religion and culture. And Sinan talked about just a couple of them, including schools and public activism. But Rohit, given your focus on media and online culture, I'd be curious to hear what you would identify as the best methods.
Yeah, and so it's a fantastic question. Thanks very much. So I would say that, again, looking at the sort of cultural field and looking at the cultural field globally in terms of its sort of global impact, the RSS and the Hindu right, till I would say, even 15, 18 years ago, they would generally appear in the limelight for absurd remarks. They would say things like, the Taj Mahal is a Hindu structure, which, we know is actually something that has ominous overtones now, with the Hindu right seeking to actually destroy mosques and churches and so on. Or they would say things like, it was the Vedas have the cure for cancer, or ancient Hindus knew about the internet, right? Or, any sort of scientific and discovery that the West can claim credit for was actually something already anticipated by Hindus. And they would be laughed at for this. And to some extent, that kind of continues. And I think it actually helps them, because that kind of provides cover for the more effective ways in which they're able to engage in their soft power initiatives, which, as I've mentioned earlier, actually sort of, create legitimacy for a number of things, including making violence more palatable. And I focus on sort of 3 or 4 things. I think one of the most important things they started doing in 2012 is engaging in or using reviving think tanks actually to promote their idea of the world. So there's a couple of think tanks that were long moribund. One was expressly founded, the India Foundation. There's another one called the Vivekananda Foundation. And then the Observer Research Foundation, which does sort of fairly good work, but works, and it is in some ways non-partisan, but they also do these marquee events with the government. So they have to do a kind of fine dance. And full disclosure, they do a big sort of Asia Internet conference. And I've spoken many, many years ago, 2016, at one of them. And I haven't been in touch with him, but I know Samir Saran, who's the president, a little bit. Now, you will have like a range of activists, digital activists from all over the world who will come and speak about, rights, about privacy. But you will also have someone who works as, the sort of tech advisor to the government of India. Or you will have, someone who, the previous head of Facebook India, Anki Das, who was known to be a Hindu right-wing activist and was completely sort of pro-partisan. So that's one of the ways in which they've been very effective, both in the domestic space and the international space, the think tank model. The second thing, which I think has been really, really powerful, is the way in which they've gone after Bollywood, right? Any Bollywood actor who has, either expressed even a sentiment that's critical of the government, not just in their films, even in their personal capacity, has been hounded, has lost endorsements, has been doxxed, they've raided them. And you suddenly have like incentives, direct and indirect, for these very jingoistic kind of films, right? Whether it's about Kashmir, whether it's about showing Muslims as terrorists. And you have the government openly funding and subsidizing absolutely third-rate, atrocious pieces of propaganda like the Kashmir Files. And when you think of the power that Bollywood wields in the Indian diaspora at large, um, internationally as well, you can really see the impact and effect that has. And that sort of, trickles down into the views that, college Hindu students in American universities have. And then the third thing is, I think, the realm, and I'll stop here, the realm of cultural festivals, cultural and literary festivals. So that, those used to be a sort of, 25 years ago, kind of marginal event, the Jaipur Literary Fest, the India Today Conclave. But at some point of time, the Hindu right wanted to sort of be at the table. And now, as I put it, frankly, the Jaipur Literary Fest, which is co-founded by Sanjoy Roy, who I think had a literary agency, and William Dalrymple, who's a really, well-known Indian, India-based Indian writer. I don't know his status of his citizenship and so on. But, they will call these Hindu godmen, they will call figures from the Hindu right. I mean, I think they're personally one step away from inviting a cow on stage at this point of time, right? And they get very defensive about it. Plus, there's the Harvard conference, there's a Harvard student conference. So all of these are ways in which the sort of legitimacy of the Hindu right and its project is sort of reinforced through soft power initiatives. And there are many consequences of it. There's just one I'll signal and end with that, which is that all of this has the effect of making their very brutal violence, which the Hindu right also engages in through other kinds of entities, it makes it more palatable. And that to me is, one of the most sort of devastating consequences of this soft power initiative. Thanks.
Thank you, Rahit. Eric, I'm going to turn to you next because I think there's a couple threads here that were brought up that are very relevant and sometimes similar to the China case. Oftentimes when we talk about Chinese soft power, almost similar to thinking about Bollywood and India, people will think about something like wolf warrior and wolf warrior diplomacy. But what you've actually written about in terms of religion and geopolitical soft power is another type of narrative, not a foreign-facing narrative as much as an internal-facing narrative, a narrative for the state. You've called that narrative the myth of foreign forces. Would you explain to us what you mean by that and what that has to do with religion?
Sure, thank you. I think this does pick up on things that Sinan and Rohit have been saying. So the simple answer is that is the persistent myth or trope deployed in Chinese writing, in media, and in policy about any incident or discontent in Xinjiang, that it must be caused by quote unquote foreign forces. This is basically a deflection in many ways. Well, it looks like a deflection from what we presume must be the Chinese state's better understanding of what's actually happening. And I think that for a long time, Western commentators have come to think that this is a cynical mythologization meant to distract from the Chinese state's actual knowledge of what's happening. But my analysis would be, this is why culture is important, this is why institutions are important, that the Chinese state actually believes this very sincerely. So, first of all, the notion of Muslims being sort of internal others or internal external people has persisted in China for about 250 years. And there are many sort of threads in Chinese culture which have emerged to create a broad sort of low-level Islamophobia, which the state has really served to drive up, especially since 2001, when, as Sean Roberts has argued, the state took on much of the language of the global war on terror and began propagating Islamophobic imagery and narratives, which made Xinjiang out to be like a Fallujah or like a Mazar-e-Sharif. You know, they really tried to depict the region as the sort of a battleground against extremist Islam. And this has led to a real self-fulfilling prophecy. And perhaps that started as a convenient myth in 2001, but it's become institutionalized in a lot of important ways, and has become narrativized in ways that have created this structure of permission that has now made it very acceptable in China when many ordinary people hear that Uyghurs and other Muslims are being interned in camps or are being monitored or being imprisoned, that a lot of people think this is okay because they do buy the notion that the region is a hotbed of Islamic terrorism. A few points here. One is the Chinese Communist Party's knowledge ecology. You know, since the 1950s, social science surveys that are meant to give an accurate picture of life on the ground and of class struggle and of cultural issues have simplified the narrative so much that they've managed to deeply ingrain the notion of foreign forces. And something I talk about in the report are a couple of incidents where, in fact, especially after the Bahrain incident in 1990, you can actually see how the analysis was prefigured by the demands of the state, which was looking for foreign forces. And so we formed a kind of echo chamber in the government. Since 2001, the study of Islamic terrorism has been increasingly institutionalized, including the rise of what I would say is, you know, a new generation of so-called Islam experts in China. There used to be actual experts on Islam in China, but there's been this whole new generation which has captured funding from the state to advance narratives and arguments that have suited the project in Xinjiang. I recall very well meeting a research team from Renmin University in Beijing, one of the top universities in China, who told me that they'd had a couple years of funding. They discovered that if you wear a hijab, you're an extremist terrorist. That was their great discovery. But this is the kind of thing, this sort of internal orientalization of Muslims, which really appeals to the state because it gives them something actionable. This kind of policy entrepreneurship is very common in the development of policy in modern China. It's how we got the one-child policy, for that matter. People offer solutions that seem elegant and that provide a narrative that the state can easily pick up on. It's since been bolstered also by things like films that depict Uyghurs as shadowy terrorists dressed in headscarves hiding in the mountains who want to blow up ordinary buses. Fundamentally, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so emphatic about this issue of narrative. I think this comes down in many ways to an increasing problem of ontological security. As David Tobin's analysis, there's sort of a deep-seated psychological insecurity also in the upper echelons of the Chinese government, which has helped to focus many of the concerns about national unity and wholeness onto a region that can easily be seen through global discourse of Islamophobia as an internal exceptional zone upon which one can enact violence with impunity. And that's been licensed by the international community very strongly. So I think there are several reasons this has persisted and why it remains appealing and why it actually seems like a natural, cogent, and correct analysis to many people in China.
Thank you, Eric. I would also invite our audience to submit questions to the Q&A feature. I have one more question for Bianca, and then we'll open it up for discussion and invite anyone that has a question to get that asked to one of our wonderful experts here. But before doing so, I'm going to take a different angle here and ask Bianca a question that's not so much about religion in global politics, but religious actors in global politics. With the recent imposition of martial law in South Korea, we saw that religious communities, especially Christian communities, Protestant and Catholic, came out very strongly against the imposition of martial law, showing that they have enduring cultural and political power. Bianca, over time, has the cultural power of religious actors become more or less important in relationships between North Korea and South Korea? And might that relationship be relevant to peace processes or dialogues in the future?
Yeah. I think they've historically always been important in terms of the relations between North and South Korea, and they continue to be important to this day. But right now, in this current moment, right, North Korea closed its borders in 2020 due to the pandemic, and they have not reopened them yet to like international groups coming in or anything like that. So cultural relations and interactions between North and South Korea have obviously become impossible to conduct through authorized or official channels since 2020. But instead of that, we've seen a rise in more unauthorized channels, including some high profile cases you might have heard of in like South Korean or Korean American missionaries go to North Korea illegally from the northwest, the along the border with China there, right? They cross the border illegally and they go into North Korea and they try to like proselytize. And right, a couple of these people have been detained, right? They were caught and detained in North Korea for this illegal proselytizing. And right, while these missionaries are well-intentioned, their missionary work carries a political agenda because they're going in as a hope to spread like dissent amongst North Koreans against the North Korean government, right? Creating this religious movement in North Korea that is sort of anti the North Korean government. So naturally, the North Korean government does not tolerate this. And the North Korean government has consistently cracked down on dissent or negative foreign influence, right? Since its founding, that's like been its one major thing that it will not tolerate is any sort of negative foreign influence or anything that would cause any sort of dissent against the government. So these unauthorized missionaries, they really only serve to worsen relations between North Korea and the rest of the world because when they get detained, right, it creates an obvious international backlash against North Korea detaining these missionaries, right, and the demand to release them. And in turn, it makes North Korea more suspicious of foreigners and less willing to welcome more international presence in the country. So I think the way forward is to continue along, right, the authorized channels and allowing more official exchange and cooperation between North Korean Protestant and other groups and right like more the international religious groups or other groups like that. And this ties in actually well with one of the questions I received right about the Unification Church or the Moonies, right? And what's the kind of Moonies influence here? So right. Interestingly, South Korea was founded by anti-communist Protestants, basically, right? They've had an interesting relationship with North Korea since the beginning. Most of the kind of founding fathers of South Korea were actually born in North Korea and right before the division, but they fled North Korea during the Soviet occupation, right, from 1945 to 1950, and then the Korean War happened, right? So a lot of North Korean born quite intellectual, politically high status people fled and they fled to South Korea and right they naturally became quite anti-communist. And one of these influential refugees, so to speak, was Sun Myung Moon, the founder of the Unification Church or the Moonies as they're called. So Moon was born in North Korea and despite his sort of ardent anti-communism, he was a very staunch supporter of Korean reunification. So he did a lot to improve religious and official dialogue and cooperation between North Korea and South Korea. So he invested in the automobile and the hotel industries in North Korea. He visited North Korea, I think, in 1992, and he claimed to be very close with Kim Il Sung, right? Who was the first president. And he sent like a package, sort of like a tribute almost of condolences to North Korea when Kim Il Sung died in 1994. And then in turn, when Sun Myung Moon passed away in 2012, North Korea made an official statement of condolence, right, to his family. So, of course, like the Unification Church, right, the Moonies and his church is highly controversial. And I don't want to get into like the intricacies of the mega churches and the scandals in South Korea, and all of that right now. But I think like Moon's relationship with North Korea is a good example of this sort of almost paradoxical dynamic in South Korea that right, Protestants have this general strong anti-communist rhetoric, but in some way that actually drives them to reach out to North Korea more in some ways because of their desire to reunify or whatever it may be. So, like going forward, we'll see what kind of interactions will resume or manifest when North Korea fully reopens their borders. They said they were going to do it by this month, December 2024, but they haven't yet. So hopefully early next year. And it seems like Kim Jong-un, it seems like he might be willing to have foreign interest in North Korea based on his really high-profile development of like tourist and leisure sites in the country. You might have seen photos of him looking all proud in front of some resort that they just built, right? But generally, I think North Korea has always returned international overtures like in kind if these overtures are not making unrealistic demands of North Korea, right? So whenever the US has done something kind of more on the dovish side rather than the hawkish side, like North Korea responds in kind. So I think it's more on the international groups, state or non-state groups, to kind of initiate or restart dialogue once the borders reopen.
Thank you, Bianca. And we're turning to a couple more questions from our audience. And again, I would invite any member of our audience to submit a question through the Q&A feature that you can find right at the bottom of the webinar screen. We actually have another question for you, Bianca, about Chongoism. Is it in both North and South Korea, and is there a connection to Buddhism?
Yeah, so Chondoism, just kind of my brief answer. So Chondoism, or Chondogyo as it's called in Korean, is it's an indigenous Korean religion that was created in the late 19th century. And it was sort of a reaction to Western encroachment, especially the spread of Catholicism and Catholic missionaries in Korea during this time. So even from that, you can already see like why the North Korean state would celebrate this religion, because it was quite literally a rejection of foreign influence and a focus on quote unquote Koreanness, right? So that obviously appealed to the North Korean official rhetoric of focusing inward and then celebrating, Koreanness over the foreign influence. But not to like simplify it, but it is essentially like a mix of Confucian ideas of like self-refinement with kind of some Buddhist and Taoist ideas, right? It's Chon-do-gyo. So the do is the same like Hancha, same Chinese character as Tao. So they are trying to, connect it to this idea of like the proper way. And this religion, sort of this belief system, sought to give Koreans like a sense of self-worth at a time of major crisis on the peninsula, right? In the late 1800s, it was a time of foreign encroachment and, right, this kind of sense of what's going to happen to Korea when all these Western powers are coming in and they're obviously more, technologically advanced, and what's going to happen to Korea in the future. So that's why Chongoism appealed to a lot of Koreans, especially like peasants and those who kind of felt very disenfranchised by the changes that were occurring on the peninsula at that time. And right in North Korea, it's always been celebrated, as I've said, right, as a kind of expression of Koreanness. And as I mentioned, right, there's even a political party in North Korea called the Chondoist Chongu Party that has seats in the Supreme People's Assembly and has some say in the politics ostensibly. So beyond that, though, I don't know the details of like how many adherents are right Chondoist in North Korea, and like what kind of community is there of Chondoism in North Korea. In South Korea too, it is, since it's kind of a form of like shamanism, so to speak, right? A lot of South Koreans will not, like, they'll say that they're shamanists, but if if you give them like a survey and identify your religion, they will usually like not sure, right? Because it tends to be syncretic in terms of like you can be Protestant and still adhere to some parts of Chondo ideas or something else. So it's kind of hard to pin it down in the sense of like how we consider Western religions that are more easy to categorize in those ways that we categorize Western religions. So, but it's really interesting. So I recommend reading more into Chondoism and the history there.
Thank you, Bianca. And it seems the audience agrees with you that it's interesting. We have another question actually about Protestantism in North Korea. Can you talk more about Protestantism in North Korea writ large, what Protestant sects are in North Korea, and has Christian missionary work been illegal in North Korea? Is it possible to legally proselytize in North Korea as a foreigner?
Yeah, that's a good question. What about more about Protestantism? So as far as sects, I'm not sure exactly which ones are the most prevalent, but I do know that, as I mentioned, right, there's about 400,000 right now as officially counted, but there's probably more than that because there was a sense of like Protestants who are authorized by the state and Protestants who are not authorized by the state, right? So the ones who are not authorized tend to be more of in the vein of what I mentioned, like those who have met with foreign missionaries and have kind of their Protestantism is more of a politicized in the form of a political dissent against the state, but also more than that, after the Korean War, Protestantism went basically underground in North Korea because it was associated with being American, right? And at that time, right after the Korean War, anything American was obviously not a good thing to be in North Korea, and there was a lot of negative association with Protestantism because not only because of its Americanness, but right, a lot of North Korean civilians during the war would hide in Protestant churches, the assumption that the Americans would not bomb Protestant church. But, unfortunately, American carpet bombing kind of destroyed most of the infrastructure in North Korea, including the churches. So there were a lot of civilian casualties from people who were hiding out in churches, right? So that's why this sort of organized sense of Protestantism really fell off after the Korean War. And people who just many North Koreans like voluntarily gave it up because of what had happened during the war, but the ones who decided to remain Protestant kind of did it underground, right? Because there wasn't an authorized channel, so they would just worship in their own homes. But then, right, as time went on and North Korea began to get more involved with international groups and international Protestantism, the North Korean state tried to adapt international Protestantism to North Korean Protestantism. And these two groups had been totally separate for since like 1945 to about late 1970s, right? So about 30 years where they had no interaction with each other. So the way that North Korean Protestants were worshiping was obviously very different from the way that people outside of North Korea were worshiping. So when these official channels were finally created and international Protestants went to North Korea to like help out, they thought it was fake. Like they thought it was all for show because it was so different from what they were used to. But right, it was just the way the North Korean Protestants were experiencing their own religion in their own specific circumstances. So right. So but the more they interacted, the more that they believed that, okay, these North Korean Protestants are for real. Like they're not just faking this, right? So that's why I think it's important to continue these interactions because there is that big sense of everything that foreigners see in North Korea is fake, right? It's all staged, right? So that's why the more we can interact with North Koreans, the more we can see that no, right, it's not staged. There are Protestants there who are legitimately worshiping as Protestants. And then just to quickly answer the second part, right, that there is no illegal proselytizing, right? That's definitely not allowed in North Korea because it's considered a suspicious foreign influence, right? That even if you travel to North Korea as a tourist, there are certain things you're like absolutely not allowed to bring with you. And on that list of banned items are anything that could be considered, proselytizing stuff. So no Bibles, of course, nothing along those lines. So not allowed in any way. So that's why these illegal missionaries are going there and doing this. It's kind of like breaking every rule, kind of in North Korea's perspective. So that's why I think it causes a lot of problems, even though they do it with good intentions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. And I know that Judd has a question actually prepared for Eric.
Oh, thanks, Julia. Well, thank you, Bianca, for being willing to handle several North Korea-related questions coming your way. Much appreciate that. Actually, a question for our other three panelists, if I may, perhaps starting with Eric. A practical, sort of tactical question. How do you cut through this dichotomy between being perceived as and blasted, dismissed as anti-China because of your critique or who you're allying with? On the one hand, or on the other hand, being quiet, even if you have concerns, but being quiet about it. In some cases, even some Muslim majority states have even praised what the Chinese have done in Xinjiang. How does one cut through that? And I think that question might also apply, at least to some extent, in the Indian context, where to raise concerns about the BJP and the RSS is to be perceived in some quarters as being anti-India, anti-Hindu, that sort of thing. How does one engage thoughtfully, critically, raise concerns without being immediately dismissed and perhaps even harassed as anti-China or anti-India?
So interestingly, I've had people in the Chinese government say that they like most of my work and agree with many of the things I say, but we disagree on conclusions, which is a fascinating thing to hear. I'm sure there are many things we disagree on quite sharply. Fortunately, I'm a historian and I'm not usually called upon to make big public statements. But my sense has been that it's important to be very clear about where one is coming from in terms of one's politics. You cannot represent all Uyghur people. For example, you cannot speak to all those interests because those interests are naturally heterogeneous, they're complex. And so I'm very clear that most of my perspective reflects my interactions with the scholars in the Uyghur region, in Xinjiang, whom I have known, and the kind of research that we thought would actually help cut through this sort of, what's the word? Very divided pair of narratives between the Chinese state narrative and an international Uyghur nationalist narrative. Half of those people, of course, have now been imprisoned. But I make it very clear that I'm speaking as a scholar who remains empirically grounded, and the things I say are empirically grounded as much as they can possibly be. And I like to point out that for most of my career, I have worked for a China-US understanding, and that this is a moment where, quite frankly, China has succeeded in losing a lot of friends abroad. It also helps, I think, to be very clear about who your allies are abroad. There are Uyghur diaspora groups, especially youth groups, who do amazing work where it is needed, in the sense of supporting organizations that support Uyghur culture and society and social organizing and education all around the world. And these are people who are sincerely doing good work that results in community building and community resilience in ways that, quite frankly, a lot of the high-profile political advocacy simply does not. So you choose where your battles are, is, I think, my understanding. You fight where you stand. Does that answer the question?
No, it does. That's very helpful, Eric. I appreciate that. And Rohit or Sinan, did you want to speak to that issue?
Sure.
In the Indian?
Yeah, I can add some thoughts. And actually, it sort of echo what Eric says. I should just, as Eric was speaking, one of the things I wanted to ask him was if he has seen the trope of this idea of the deep state, because this is a trope that the Hindu right has picked up recently. Relatively recently, they've picked it up from the American right. And just last week, the BJP itself, like politicians in the BJP, have accused the American deep state of undermining India. And America has said that this is absolutely absurd. And of course, it has to do with the, this crony capitalist Gautam Adani being charged by the SEC, who's very close to Narendra Modi. So, I would agree with Eric. I think in the BJP, again, we see some sort of similarities in what Eric pointed out. The idea of the foreign hand is a long-standing trope in Indian society, which predates the BJP, the Hindu right. Indira Gandhi of the Congress used to invoke the foreign hand, as it was called, all the time. And America was sort of the bad guy because of India's relationship with the USSR. And the BJP kind of inherited that, and it's gone with this idea of a toolkit. And it's this crazy conspiracy stuff that involves everyone from Soros to, Hillary Clinton, to the Pope, to America at times. And, there are all kinds of contradictions because on the other hand, America is celebrated and the India-US relationship is celebrated. In the BJP, I would say, you have enough people in the top brass who are actually very smart and who know this is just meant to sort of, whip up outrage. But even at the top brass, even at the highest level, and percolating downwards, there is an amazingly significant number of people who actually think that there is this conspiracy out to undermine Hindus, which they see as synonymous with Hinduism, which they see as synonymous with Indian identity. And I think the thing is just, when you have the conversations, just to sort of show them the evidence, just to show the proof, just to kind of do the work and tell them that this is what I'm doing. this is what I'm showing you what the Hindu right is doing, Hindu far right groups like the Hindu American Foundation are doing. This is what the issue is. There is no conspiracy here. And I think you get through. And I think, again, to echo what Eric said, some of the more high profile events actually I've, come to see as in some ways actually, winding up making the problem worse, which take on for whatever reason. And I'll leave it at that. I know we're running out of time. Thanks. But thanks. Fantastic question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, quickly, just to echo what Rohit said as well, right? Like a lot of my research is generally focused on, it's focused on foreign policy, for example. So here it's about like what are the different tools under foreign policy, and in that way does Hindutva play a role? Because I've looked at, Islam and foreign policy as well. I've looked at different actors like jihadist actors as well. A lot of like, Muslim non-state violent actors across the Middle East, across India. So really for me, it's just a matter of like, this is a continuation of a lot of my research in terms of what is it now that the Hindu right wing is doing in India? And if I were, let's say, because I'm in the UK right now, and if I was to stay here long enough, then I'd probably start looking at the British right wing or the English right wing as well over time, right? Just because I'm here, I can actually do the research, and it for me, it's very interesting as a research subject. So within that, the way research is presented and the way it actually comes out at the end of the day is, it is for other actors to understand and interpret it according to their own understanding. But for me, it's like, okay, this is the empirical data, and this is how I want to like then present it out, for others to see over here. So I don't often think that it is an anti-India research of sorts or an anti-Hindu research as well. It's literally like Rohit said, it's more about what is the empirical data and the analysis that comes out of it, and we're just trying to understand the role of religion, or what role does religion actually play over here in these dynamics. So yeah, I'll end it with that.
Thank you all. So we're coming up to our closing time, but we do have 2 more questions in chat. So I'm going to ask the panelists to take just no more than 30 seconds or so to try to provide the best answer they can. The first one is for you, Rohit. If you could answer quickly, we have a question about the socialization of Hindu children and their family culture in this context. If you could just maybe comment on that quickly.
Yeah, so that, socialization into ideas about the separateness of Hindus and Muslims, the otherness of Muslims, is something that predates the Hindu right. But I think it, especially with social media now, it's really become sort of, quite terrible. And I think part of the problem is that when you have that message being sent to you by different peer groups, including your family itself, then when you have YouTube videos, which are showing anti-Muslim pop songs, when you have TikTok videos, it just makes things that much worse. So it's a compounding, amplifying factor.
Thank you. And our final question of the day, we have a question up for you, Eric. How are other Muslim minorities treated in China, and how can we explain the differences?
Other Muslim minorities in China, in Xinjiang, similarly. And now the treatment is spreading across the rest of China. There's a recent Financial Times article, very well researched, on the Sinicization of Islam that you'll want to look at. Basically, the policies pioneered in Xinjiang have been expanded to other sites of Muslim worship across northwestern and central China, particularly the destruction of anything that aesthetically looks Muslim in the sense of looking quote unquote Middle Eastern. So they'll smash an onion dome and put a pagoda top in its place. And there's increasing Islamophobia. Look at the work of David Stroup, Stroup, and of Hannah Thieker, Theaker, who are doing a deeper dive on that.
Thank you. And I'll turn it back over to Judd to close us out. And thank you.
Well, thank you, Julia, for facilitating the conference, the conversation so ably. Thank you to our panelists for sharing your time, your insights with us, addressing your questions. Really, really grateful. If you want to read further, there's new research from our scholars today on the Berkley Center website, so please avail yourself of that, and certainly join us in the future for more Berkley Center USIP conversations around the geopolitics of religion. Thank you all for joining us.